Thank you. Thank you, Justin, again. Thank you, Joi-san, for having me. So the title of this panel, I called it "Fermented Food is the Next Creative Commons." So basically, I've made this logo just quickly this morning. So CC and FF. Why did I come up with this idea? Because I was personally maintaining this ferment vat, which is quite huge actually. It's like this, so it can contain about 5 kilograms of nuka doko. So without any deep thinking, I just placed the Creative Commons seal on top of the vat, and someone took a photo and posted it on the internet. His name is Julian Bleeker, and he's a user interface designer. And we had this conversation. So why are you doing this? Why are you maintaining a ferment vat in your office? Which is actually, this is my office. And I was just, coming to the office in the morning, just taking out some, fermented cucumber or like any other kind of veggies, and sharing with my friends in the office. And I almost had the same feeling of, good feeling of sharing contents through making it open with a Creative Commons license on the internet and sharing veggies, good tasting veggies in the real world. And I was asked by the Japanese edition of the Wired magazine to go check some fermented food companies in Japan and write an article. So I said, okay, why not? And I just went to this. This is a fermented food only restaurant in Kyoto. So everything they make is fermented. Well, obviously the rice is not fermented, but almost everything is fermented. This is a natto dipping sauce plate. I also went to this. So one thing very interesting in Kyoto is almost all the traditional food makers in Kyoto are like more than 100 years old. So when you say your company is 50 years old, you're still young, basically. So this is Sawai Shoyu Honten, and they have a history of 150 years. So you just go inside, and as you mentioned, it has its own smell and odor. So the whole block where this shop is located have this very unique smell, and you can watch inside the giant vat, and you can really feel it's alive by watching it, by sensing it. And one thing I was really amazed is I found this gravestone for microbes, which is crafted next to a traditional temple, Buddhist temple, and it's written this. So I translated. So in memorial of the spirits of hundreds of the millions of bacteria who have sacrificed themselves to contribute to the survival of humanity. I was, wow, this is really Japanese. And I was wondering who made this, and I found out it was a CEO of a chemical company in Kyoto. So he made his company big through making experiments with enzymes, I guess. And so at the end of his life, I think he passed away. At the end of his life, he regretted to have killed so many billions of microbes. And he asked the Manjuin temple to build this thing. And why am I bringing this up? Because I wanted to talk about the cultural aspect and maybe the not the spiritual aspect. I don't want to go too far with the spiritual aspect, but how this culture of fermenting food influence our way of thinking in our everyday life. So this is really very amenistic view towards something you can really interact with, right? Without any scientific tools. So that's one thing. And I went to fermented food workshop in Kisomachi. And Kisomachi has this really unique product, which is called sunki. And this is only in Kisomachi, even in Japan, so I think it's the only place in the world. This is a lactic acid bacteria fermentation that does not use any salt, so it's not salty at all. And maybe by coincidence, this city became the municipality with the highest longevity in Japan just last year, and they eat a lot of sunki. So we invited 3 professors from the Tokyo Agriculture University. So all of the doctors on the right, Dr. Okada, Tachi, and Hosaka, who are respectively authorities of fermentation. So we went to do a workshop, and we gave everyone alcohol and fermentation soft drinks from all over the world. This is cheese from the world. This is lactic acid fermented food from the world. This is other lactic acid fermented food from the world. We visited a koji malt workshop in Japan, which is great. And this Dr. Hosaka, who came to the workshop, so he's authority of Zymergy, if I pronounce it right. And he's also the consultant for the manga creator Ishikawa-san, who draws this manga called Moyashimon, which talks about this boy who can see the bacteria floating in the air. And what Dr. Hosaka said in this workshop is really interesting. So he says fermentation is at the intersection of life engineering and sociology, because if you can quantify everything by chemical formula, you could think that you can just simply create the best tasting food by trying to find out the best mathematical chemical formula, but that doesn't happen because every person's taste is different. So that's where sociology comes into play. So that's why you have to master both sociology and life engineering. And another findings which kind of shocked me is this Dr. Okada. So he's an authority of vegetable lactic acid fermentation, and he has his own lab in Kisomachi. And he drew this very dirty drawing on a sheet of paper, and he explained to me that so the lactic acid bacteria, according to his own finding, had the traces of a TCA cycle engine embedded in their organ that they acquired in the process of evolution sometime in the past. So they were actually doing aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism at the same time. So they were creating, just as we breathe, and we also have both in our body, but the lactic acid bacteria, they seem to have that before, sometime in the past, but they kind of abandoned that later on, and they opted to just dwell inside a very, rich environment, which is glucose-full environments, such as bread and nukadoko. So I wanted to bring this up because so our biologic metabolism system is also diverse. It's not only the TCA cycle way of creating 36 ATP by breathing, but we also have fermenting metabolism. So maybe we can compare different types of metabolism and try to refer how our mind works with that. Sorry, I'm talking too long. So I will stop about here. So that was a founding, right? So they once obtained aerobic metabolism, but they opted out and selected just anaerobic metabolism. So they opted this very slow process of getting energy. So maybe that's inspiring for us. So I have other few slides, but I want to stop here and have your feedbacks or.
Well, first, explain this slide.
Oh, this slide. Okay. I didn't say anything about this slide. Okay. So Creative Commons, maybe. Okay. So Creative Commons, the idea of Creative Commons, the idea of commons comes from a very physical notion of having a same territory of resourceful environment that you can share with other agents. So Creative Commons is a network of open contents, so where the creators themselves express the will of opening up their rights to invite other creators to work and create a remix of their work. So that creates a whole ecology of creation on top of the internet. So that's the basic idea of Creative Commons. And why I put Fermented Food besides it, because I found similarities and differences of the notion of creation. So the similarities, I think I mentioned in, or early on in the talk, but the difference is that it's way less individual based. So it's almost, it doesn't matter if I am the owner of the vat or you are the owner of the vat, but what matters most is what kind of history did it go through. Mm-hmm. So maybe at the Ito family, you have a history of 100 years of making fermented food. And maybe in my family, maybe my Chinese branch of ancestors came in to play somewhere. So a very rich, maybe we can think about traceability of those very complex mixture of components inside the same vat. Mm-hmm. So maybe that opens up to a new idea of authorship. Mm-hmm. Trying to think what does it mean to be creative? Do we really have to assume that we have to be a creative individual, or do we have to focus more on how to create a creative team or community? So that kind of train of thought came into my mind.
Yeah, I think. So I think it's the remix culture part that's sort of similar. Right. By the way, I have a question. Mm-hmm. Was your Nukamiso good?
Really good.
Is it good? Is it alive?
It's not alive. It's dead, actually. Unfortunately.
And where did because if you Google Nukamiso, by the way, mm-hmm. the first result after Wikipedia is my Nukamiso guide, mm-hmm. and this is over 10 years ago. But I spent a lot of energy trying to understand Nukamiso, and I got a little bit from 50-year-old batch in Kyoto Ochaya, and I got some from Kikuya, which is a pickles place in Kyoto, and I got some from different places, and I tried to figure it out, and it was pretty good, but it eventually dies, and then I was so devastated I didn't do it for a while. But when we moved to Boston, my wife started doing it, but we actually, I didn't obsess about it. We did it. So there's a trick which is with Nukamiso, if you put it in the fridge, it slows the process down and it slows everything down so that you don't have to mix it as much. Because the problem is in the warm weather, you have to mix it so often, and it can get very funky if some of the bacteria get out of control. But if you put it in a Ziploc bag and you stick it in the fridge and you mix it every day, it turns out that it tastes fine, and it actually tastes pretty good. And one of the things that I realized, and this has a parallel with me with diving, which is that even with like really crappy gear, if you're a good diver, you do much better than a not so good diver with a whole bunch of technology, right? And one of the things that I realized with Nukamiso, so like when I would go out of town, I would give it to Okame, which is one of my favorite tempura places, and they would keep my Nukamiso while I was away and stir it for me.
So that was really good.
It was always better when I got it back from them than when I had it. And they would explain it to me and show me, and I do the same thing, but it would never taste as good. And I would sometimes blame it on the fact that, well, maybe my house doesn't have as good an environment as under the thing at a restaurant. But one of the things that was really interesting for me was that kind of like trying to get your head around it didn't actually make it as good as. And the other thing is there's almost no resources online. You can Google all you want, but there's all these kind of poorly written things, but when you actually start to do it, you learn it intuitively. So I'm curious, because for me, there's a lot of pieces like remix culture where you're getting inspiration from other people. There's also at the genetic level as well as the material level to the process level. Those are all things that you're getting from other people. But it's not digitizable, right? It's like I can put up my guide, and I bet everyone could follow what my guide says, and you could make Nukamiso that tastes terrible, right? And I'm curious how you learn, and first of all, whether, you know.
Well, I think everyone starts as a autodidactic way, so no resource on the internet, and just verbal transmission is still the most reliable way to learn how to do it, I think. And in Japanese books, I think you have a bunch of really good textbooks about how to maintain and not to kill your ferment batch, stuff like that. But I think the most amazing thing I experienced through fermentation is that it has its own biological logic of creation. So I almost feel like I was a slave of the microbes. I had to.
You are.
Yes, I had to sacrifice my time and my energy to not to be disliked by the microbes. And
it's actually the microbes here talking to the microbes here.
Oh, okay.
And they're communicating with each other, and
that's
Because the reason you want to make it is because you want to eat it.
Yeah.
The reason you want to eat it is because somebody inside saying, tell them to make him want to eat it, right?
Exactly.
So I think the world is controlled by microbes and advertising agencies. the two of those together is what makes us do everything.
It's better that the microbes gain control over the advertising agencies. Right?
Well, no, you never know. Advertising agency people may just actually be a form of microbe.
Okay. for the society.
But I think also the other part where we should think about it from a Creative Commons perspective is who owns it, right? Because as we start to figure it out, there's definitely intellectual property. We'll hear from AO Biome and Biome and other companies who are in this space, and there's it's interesting because the business model that Creative Commons tried to support was sort of communities of amateurs and people sharing and things like that. And even in the tradition in Japan, there's a lot of sharing, but there's a lot of trade secrets too. All of these kura have their things that they don't want to teach you how to do, and they want to differentiate. So kind of this, and this ties to the creative act, right? So some people believe strongly that there is such a thing as an individual creative act, and other people would say that you're just passing things from the past to the future and maybe possibly editing it. And the value of that creative act is different depending whether you're talking to George Lucas or a monk that's transcribing. And so I think that's also an interesting question of what's going to create the most vibrant ecosystem, because I think that if you allow law or business to lock up certain layers, you may create a different environment than if you make it open. And I think it's still very open to see.
So I tried to collect some voices around the fermented food culture. So this is a Japanese magazine called Spectator, and they did a fermented food special issue on that. And basically, they were asking many kind of beer brewers in Japan and trying to know what they think about what they're doing. So almost everyone was talking about. So it's not about control; it's about a conversation with the microbes. And another brewer said almost the same thing as I said earlier. So the brewer obeys the bacteria. So the yeast is his boss, kind of thing. And the other thing is microbes don't just consume things up. So they always redistribute part of what they decompose as nutriment for other beings.
But I think understanding microbes is a very good way to understand, because you use the word sustainability, but the ecosystem. Because in nature, traditionally, when you have evolution, if you have an abundance of something, it's because something is outputting that. Right. And then that abundance causes something else to use that as input. And so somebody's output is always somebody else's input, and everything is connected together. And if you have something, if your input disappears, you die, and if some input, like for instance, if you look all the way back at the first photosynthesis, where before that everything was anaerobic,
right.
And I think there was an abundance of iron. Iron was used in a lot of the pathways, and when cyanobacteria came and started creating oxygen that would bind with the iron and take it out, it was the biggest extinction event that had ever happened, and suddenly you had all the dying of this whole species, and then the oxygen created what we have. But back then, oxygen was kind of like a poison, right? And so I think that what's interesting when we think about ecosystems is like the notion of waste. That there's no such thing as waste. So there's like some material that's created, and something else consumes this other material. So human beings, and this is why I think the human-centric view of the world is kind of misguided. We are something that takes certain inputs and creates certain outputs. But because we haven't, and because we've done this so quickly, we have this idea that, sustainability sounds like something that it's cheaper or wastes less energy. But the fact is, everything is a cycle. And I think what's interesting when you look at microbes is that they don't act, they just convert one thing to another. They don't consume and exhaust waste, right? And I think that's kind of interesting, because I think that's when we think about systems design, that's what, and then if you think about humans in that system, so what is our waste? And I think that's one of the interesting things when you think about sort of urban planning. You know, the sewage system really, the modern sewage system really took something that used to be the input. If you read, I think it was, what was it? Stephen Johnson's book, right. Ghost Trails, where he shows that the large cities like Rome, those all grew because all of the human waste was plowed back into the lands that made the land sustain more agriculture, that sustained more people, that created more poop, that created more agriculture. So if it weren't for the reclaiming of the human waste, you would never have been able to build cities so large, right? But now we just throw it away. And so I think and I think Neri Oxman teaches this class called Design Across Scales, and I think you can learn from the microbial scale things that we should be doing at the human scale, the city scale, the terraforming scale. So I think that this is if we could just take this sensibility that we're learning from the microbes and bump it up to like product design and stuff.
To the whole society. Yeah. Also, another, I didn't put this in the slides, but I was watching your talk with Buddhist monks, Daiko Matsuyama, and you were talking about this idea of mindfulness and well-being, and that was really interesting because many people relate the idea of fermented food, of creating and consuming fermented food with this idea of well-being. At least in Japan, as far as I can see, because it's getting more popular, and people don't just consume fermented food because it tastes good, but for health, not just health also, but for beauty, and not just beauty again, but also it makes you feel good at the end of the day. So what's that? Because basically what you're doing is just. If I follow your theory of my bacteria, just following the bacteria of the vat, where does my mind comes into play? So your talk with the Buddhist monk Daiko Matsuyama, your question was really relevant to me in that sense. You were questioning about basically the meditation methodologies brings mindfulness, right? But the very action of meditation might not be scalable because it requires a high level of trainings. So you were asking about how scalable is meditation as a way of spreading well-being and mindfulness. And I was thinking about that in relation with the fermented food, and maybe this might be the very scalable methodology to satisfy your utilitarian needs at the same time, and maybe your psychological peace of mind.
I think that fermentation is interesting because fermented food is a way for the microbes to cause us to keep them around. Because I think if you look at the gut biome, and this is secondhand stuff, and I don't know I think they're just starting the research. But if you look at the gut biomes of people that lived a long time ago, they're very different than the bacteria that we have now, and they're genetically different. And a lot of them may behave similarly, but a lot of them have disappeared, and new ones are coming. And weirdly, the fermented the bacteria that we have, they're being sort of protected by us because they're useful to us and we're useful to them. And but I do think that they can mutate as well. So I think what's interesting and important is to also think about how, this natto that we have now, as it enters America, is losing its sliminess, it's mutating, we're causing it to, live on and persist. And if you're thinking about it from the perspective of the microbe, first of all, the human beings and fermentation is a great way to spread, right? But also the fact that it adjusts to each place is really important. And I think where it ties to meditation, so when you do meditation, one of the things you're trying to do is become aware. And as you become aware, for instance, drop into your subconscious, you realize that you're different from everybody else, and that extrinsic things, drivers like money or status, become less important. You try to create intrinsic motivators. And similarly, I think all of our guts and our DNA and our systems are very different. And what you really want, and this is the sort of personalized medicine thing, is you sort of want to try to figure out how you become aware of what you really want. And a lot of people say if you eat very healthy food, you should start to crave what will be most healthy for you. And the problem right now is with the way we think about food and the way it's advertised to us. We eat food that we think we want, and we get in a cycle, but it's not actually what our body wants. So we've lost touch with our ability to be aware of what our body really needs. And so that's where I would say our microbes, when they're functioning properly, should be the ones sending signals to our brain saying, hey, you need a little bit or more of this, and maybe you should have some chocolate because I can convert it to this for you. And that relationship with the community, I mean, this is kind of like your population. You're the mayor, and you're either listening to it or you're listening to the federal government. And it's like, right now, a lot of this comes from the outside. So I think the scalability, which is important, is it has to be a diverse scalability. I think the problem with a lot of the McWellness stuff, like all the wellness apps and things, and all the things that's supposed to make you healthy, is that it's not going to be the same for everybody. And I think this is what we're learning even with like cancer medicine. Like sometimes you'll have a cancer treatment that works on 2% of the people, and they'll say, oh, okay, well, we can't pass it because it doesn't work for 98% of people. But it turns out those 2% of the people have a particular gene mutation. So if you filter for that, it has 100% effectiveness. And so the fact that we are starting to realize that we're different, but in the short run, until we catch up with science, I think our microbes are possibly the ones that can tell us the best because it's already connected to our brains. And I think the part that we've spent a lot of our advertising money on and fast food on is sort of disconnecting the conversation between our microbes and our brain. And I think fermentation is a place where we kind of have this intentional relationship with the microbes. So to me, that's when I think about like scalability of things like meditation and mindfulness, is that what you don't want is like a particular outcome to be scaled, because then you lose diversity.
Monolithic way of just attaining that situation, right? So maybe because it's really interesting, because I'm working a lot with advertising agencies, actually.
Well, they also have the key, because they can fix it too.
And almost all of them are talking about they can't reach their target because everyone's interest is so diverse, and they have to reach the intrinsic core values of these people. So I think that's kind of your question kind of echoes with that situation of this world getting more diverse, and but at the same time we have a lens with a higher resolution, so we can take a look at each case and not to just unify all of them in a monolithic methodology. So I think that's a really explicit challenge to even for advertising agency, as for individuals like us, and trying to find the best way to communicate with your own community, and maybe through other communities, like conversation model.
Thank you.
And it just ends.
All right. Thank you, Dominick.
Thank you. Thank you, Joi-san.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.